I want to welcome everybody to the August 2020 San Jose Astronomical Association Imaging Special Interest Group meeting. We are very happy and feel very privileged to have Eric Coles presenting tonight. And Eric has some phenomenal new ways of processing using Photoshop. And I think with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Eric.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Well, I don't know if they're phenomenal, but they've been interesting. And what I've tried to do, I'm primarily an imager for Emission Nebula and other reflection nebula. And in the Hubble palette images, there's a standard mapping, an SHAA mapping, and there was a standard procedure mostly copied from J.P. Metzavenio, who's really an expert in this area. But in the last few months, I've kind of developed another technique which brings out more of the color variation in different parts of the nebula. But before we do that, I just thought I would go over kind of what my setup is at Sierra Remote Observatory. Let me see, present now your entire screen. I think this is the screen we want to present. Share. And let me get PowerPoint from the beginning. All right, are you seeing that? Bruce?
Yes, we're seeing it.
Okay, yeah, I know there's a little bit delay. We have the same thing on the Astro Imaging channel. Someone asks a question, we have to fumble and get our mics turned on before we answer. So this is my setup out at the SRO. You can see it's an Astrophysics Ricardi Honders 305 3.8 scope. A real exotic piece of hardware, probably the most pleasing scope that I've ever imaged with in the past 10 years. It's fast, it's big, it collects a lot of light. It's the camera is a 16-200 with the 8 filters, the normal 7. Then I have a near infrared filter, which really hasn't done any good, but it fills up the filter wheel. It's on a plane wave direct drive L mount. There's no rolling over. It just goes from one side to the other and is, again, a real pleasure to work with. This whole setup really disappears, so I start it in the evening and come back and collect data in the morning. You can see it's mounted on a wedge, and this big boat anchor you see in the bottom was an offset pier. We need to have the offset pier, otherwise it would have hit the wall. And you can see it's pouring it against a flat screen, so I take my flats when I change the rotation in the camera. And software we run by ACP, Maximum Collect, and Focus Max, and then PI4 to control the mount. And everything is done remotely. I have physically never actually touched any of this equipment. It just gets sent out to California, and I get to see it on the screen. Next slide. And I have a short video. Let's see if we can get this started. So I just had one of the techs take the video, and I just had it point to 3 stars, even though the roof is closed on that. And you can see it isn't even moving at the fastest speed. It'll move it at about 50 degrees per second if you wanted to, but there's no need to do that. And shortly it will go to the next star. Sorry, it took me a while just to punch in the next star for it to go to. I probably should have scripted that. And then at the end of the run, it'll go point directly to the flat panel. And if I have to run the flats, I'll probably do that in the morning. And you can see how quiet this is. If you've seen this at the AIC, you know it makes basically zero noise. So if anyone's in the vicinity when this thing is moving, it's gonna whack them one. Yep, come on, next. Okay, that's enough of that. Why don't we start processing? So let me tell you what we're gonna do here. I can shut this and open up Photoshop. So basically, we're going to process a couple Emission Nebula. Both of these were some data that I collected from Australia because they're very colorful nebula. Normally, we take the stacks and we'll go into PixInsight. We'll take the linear files. We'll create the nonlinear files. We'll take care of all the noise. And then we'll create a second file which has no stars, because what we're going to do here with this SHO map processing is do tone mapping. And the tone mapping is done with the starless images, and then a luminosity layer is put in on top of that. So the first image I'm going to process is called the Tarantula Nebula. And I'm going to open up 4 files: the hydrogen alpha, which has stars in it, the hydrogen alpha that doesn't have stars in it, the starless image, and the starless image for the oxygen and sulfur. In this case, I don't really need the sulfur and oxygen images with stars because we are doing tone mapping. Let me just open those up. So there are 4 images. And let me just arrange them. Let's see. Yeah, this. So this is the Tarantula, the hydrogen alpha with stars. And then we have them in order that we're going to map them to RGB. The sulfur, the oxygen, and well, we got them a little bit out. It'll be sulfur. Let me move this over. Hydrogen alphas and oxygen. You might notice that you probably have, you say, well, you haven't removed all the stars here, but those are actually small star clusters. Those are not star residues. So let's start making our mapped image. And I'm going to simply copy, starting with the sulfur, mark all, copy, create new image. And we're going to create an RGB image and paste in our sulfur image. Histogram. So you see, we start off where all the channels are really just the sulfur starless image. So now I'm going to get the data from the hydrogen alpha. Again, mark all, copy, put it into our new image, and put that in the green. So now we're mapping hydrogen alpha to the green channel. Paste it in. Go back and get the oxygen image, copy, move it over into our new image, and I'll put that in the blue channel. So the standard SHO mapping is sulfur is red, hydrogen alpha is green, and oxygen 3 is blue. And here's our starting image. Let's go to the layers. Now you might say that that's not really a bad image. Maybe we should just stop there. But there are different levels of intensity in this image. And the idea in this kind of tone mapping SHO image is to balance all of the 3 contributions approximately equally. In most images, perhaps not in this one, the hydrogen alpha will really dominate and this image will be green. So we don't want that. So normally what someone will do is simply go in, let me bring up the histogram, and just balance these 3. And then you're done with it. You put on your luminosity layer and that's the end of your image. But I really figured out that you can get a better image and more variation in color if you treat different parts of the image based on their lightness differently, select them, and then balance those particular histograms. So the way we're going to illustrate that is first, let's just make a copy of this layer. And I'm going to make a series of these selections and balance each one, balance the histogram so that the three contributions of the hydrogen alpha, sulfur, and oxygen are approximately equal. So let me get my little selection tool. And I think the best way to do this, let's not do that, is I'm going to select this bright area. And you might say that your selections are pretty ragged. And actually, that's a technique. You don't want them to be too smooth, because if they are, then you will see the interface between the areas that you've selected. And to do this even further, I'm going to feather this. But first, I'm going to select the inverse. So now I've selected this dark area here. And now I'm going to feather this, make it even fuzzier, 250 pixels. And now we're going to get rid of those darn marching ants. I always hate the marching ants. So let's just hide the marching ants. But we still have selected this area versus this unselected area. And you can see the histogram really isn't balanced. So I'm going to go in and balance them kind of visually the best I can by getting adjustments and levels. I'll move this over. I assume you can see the histogram even if you can't read the writing that's in each of these areas. But what I'm going to do is simply select the red, and I'm just going to broaden the histogram and overlap them the best I can. Green, get rid of the area where there's not much data. So now we have after and before. So we've gotten rid of the overcontribution of the sulfur in this case. And now we've made one adjustment. So now I'm going to select, well, let's make another layer so we can see the progress as we move along. I'm going to copy this layer. I'm going to select the inverse, which means I've now select a slightly brighter area, hide those marching ants, and I'm going to adjust the histogram again. This one is reasonably balanced, but I'm going to broaden it out a little bit by getting rid of this area down here. There's red. Okay, now so far we really haven't seen a dramatic change in this image, but as we get down and get into the brighter areas, you will see the difference. So we're going to unselect that, make another copy of the layer. And now I'm going to select a smaller and brighter area. Let's do this guy right here. And again, a very irregular selection. We're going to feather the selection. Let's feather it 200 pixels. Hide the marching ants. And adjust the histogram. Get rid of that area down there. There's before or after and before. Make another copy. Oh, you know, one thing I forgot to do. We should always, before we start, assign a profile, because you're going to display your images who knows where, and you want people, when they bring it up on the monitor, that your image displays as close to what you intended it to be as when it was on your monitor. And if you don't do that, then it will be displayed according to the color profile, the default color profile that they have on their monitor. So there are a couple profiles that I generally use. This is kind of the default, but I think for Emission Nebula, where you want to really bring out the color, you want to use this profile. And I find that to be a much more interesting, colorful Hubble palette. So let's make another copy. I might have made another copy, but I can't remember. And let's just select, no, don't do that. Unselect first. Select this really bright area. And you can see we're going to the brighter and the brighter and the brighter areas and adjusting the color for each one of those. Selection, modify, feather. Let's select 150 pixels, no marching ants. Gets a little repetitive, but it really doesn't take too long to do. So now let's adjust that histogram. Let's balance these the best we can. Bring up the red a little bit. And I think by now you can see that you're really trying to get and are getting some more definition in this central area than where we started. And that's really the idea. And I think I'm going to make one more selection. Just select this area in here. Let's zoom in on a little bit. This is our tarantula. Feather it again. No, let's try selections. Let's select, I don't know, 75 pixels. Get rid of marching ants. And do the levels adjustment. You can see as we work down in here, we've not only got more color in the image, but we've really broadened out the histogram, so it's filling out a larger amount between 0 and 255 levels of gray. So red. Do we have to make an adjustment? Let's see, maybe a little. And you know, I'm going to make one more adjustment, one more layer. Let's get the core of our tarantula down here. I'd like to get a little more definition. Now you can definitely see we have a lot more color in that core by making this adjustment and broadening out the histogram all at the same time. So let's zoom back out. Now that's a tone map. And you can see from the beginning, let me just go back all the way to the beginning. This is what it looked like when we started. And this is what it looks like after we made all the adjustments. Now this is just a tone map. There are no stars. So we're going to put in stars and put in a little more detail next. Bruce, are there any questions up to now?
So far, we have no questions in the chat, but please, if anybody has any questions, put them in there, and I'll ask Eric for you.
You can interrupt me. So we don't have any stars. This is just our tone map. The one thing to mention, if we tried to make these adjustments with the starred images, as we spread out the histogram, your stars would get larger and larger and larger, or smaller, and you'd end up with stars with different colored rings around it. And when you just put your SHO images together and try to make adjustments, you end up with really funky looking stars. And in any case, the star color really has no meaning when you do this kind of mapping. So if you want to do RGB images, of course you do RGB images. If you want to do Hubble palette images, you should probably end up with white stars, which is where we're going to go. So next I'm going to put in the stars. So let's take the starred image. I'll make a copy of that. And this is going to become our luminosity layer. We'll put it on top, and this is called hydrogen luminosity. And we will merge this with the layer below as a luminosity layer. Now, when you do this, it always ends up being a little bit too bright. So what I'm going to do is just adjust the levels so that we can really see the color underneath. And there's our image without stars and with stars. But there's more detail to get out of this than just using this as luminosity. And there's a technique which we use called high-pass filtering. And what this does, if you know anything about electronics, it used to be that you'd put in high-pass filters to get rid of all the noise, so you could just select the signal that you're interested in. Well, high-pass filtering when you're doing this kind of imaging is not really the same, but it cuts the histogram in a way which allows you to show the edges of each of these structures. By the way, there's one more thing that I'd like to do and just see how this works out. I'm going to make another copy. There's one adjustment. It's called the Bob Franke adjustment. So we're going to label this as BF. And I'm going to turn off the luminosity for now. And I have an action over here, and without going into what this is, it brings out a little more of the orange in the structure. So I'm going to do it, and if I like it, we'll keep it. If not, we'll just throw it away. Let's see, tone map. Where is the tone map adjustment? There he is. It's a little script I wrote. Play the script. I don't know if I like that better with a little more of the orange, but turn it off. I think I like about 60% of it. So we're going to change the opacity of that to 60%, bring in a little more of the orange in the structure. That's subtle enough. There's a luminosity layer. So now what I'm going to do in order to do the high pass filtering, I'm going to get the image with the most structural detail in the nebula, and that is the hydrogen alpha. So I'm going to make a copy of that. And before I go too much further, why don't I save this? It's always nice to save your work. This is not Karina, this is Tarantula. So let's bring out a little more detail on this. I'm going to put on, let's say, 4 copies of the starless image from the hydrogen alpha. We'll just go. We'll make 4 copies of that layer. I'm going to put them all in one folder. Turn them all off except one. And I'm going to zoom in on this kind of detailed area right here and see whether I could highlight the edges of some of these structures so as to bring out more detail. And the way we do this is we select filters, others, high pass. And we're going to make a 2-pixel pass. And let's look at the histogram. And you see what we've done. We've actually cut it more than you see right here. But if you look closely, you can see these little lines. I'm not sure if it comes across in the video. But let me zoom in. Well, can't zoom in right now. So we're going to do a high pass filter. And now you see we've cut everything except 2 pixel wide right in the center of the histogram. And now I'm going to overlay it on the top of the other image. And if you look real closely, let's zoom in really close. If I turn that off, it almost looks like you're focusing a little bit. It does bring in a little bit of noise, but we could take care of that later. So not to worry about that. So let's zoom in and make another high pass filter. This one's slightly wider than the other one. Let's make it 4 pixels wide. And you can see you have more of the structure being apparent. I'm going to overlay that on top, which will bring out those edges a little bit more. And do 2 quick ones. Let's do a 6-pixel high pass. And this one can get a little choppy, so I'm only going to, let's see, light and overlay. I'm only going to put in, say, 50% of that layer. And to bring out some of the bigger structures, we'll make a 12-pixel high pass filter. High pass, 12 pixels. Now you can see some really big structures. Overlay that on top. And that brings in too much noise. I'm only going to put that in at, say, 20%. So this is our high pass group. So now we have our tone map with luminosity, and our tone map with a high pass filter. So there is our final Hubble palette image with stars. Now the interesting thing is you don't have to have stars in there, and you can still have kind of an abstract image, which some people, including myself, find interesting. So if I turn off the luminosity layer, I have a little abstract piece of art in the Hubble palette. And oftentimes I will post that along with the one with stars. And that's our first Hubble palette image. There must be a question or two out there, Bruce.
I'm not seeing any yet, but please, guys, if you have any questions, guys and gals, please feel free. I know everybody's enjoying this so far. I know I am.
The Bob Franke, that's a kind of a green to gold.
Yeah, it's a green to gold. If you know, well, you probably know who Bob Franke is. We've exchanged data now for years, and he has a little adjustment, and I kind of like it. And
Yeah.
So at the end of all these adjustments, I usually put in a few percentage of the Bob Franke adjustment. It's just as simple going in and changing the colors a little bit. And a good Hubble palette image should go from the greens all the way to the golds and the purple. But of course, it does depend on your target, because different targets have different amount of hydrogen alpha, sulfur 2, and oxygen 3. You're right. So We always give Bob Franke credit when I do these presentations.
Eric,
And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
another thing that I missed while I was taking notes is after you put the HA luminance layer, you did something with levels, and I didn't see exactly.
Oh, you know that what you usually find if you look at the image that I put out for, let me see, the hydrogen alpha. The image that I put out for the hydrogen alpha, fits my eye, and this is what I would normally, publish this image. But when you put it as luminosity, it always tends to be a little too bright, and it mutes the colors. So here, let me just grab it again. So
Some people change the output level, and
yeah, there's different ways to handle it. So if I just put another copy of that, and I make that the luminosity layer, it just tends to mute the color. There is different ways of doing it. I just do it with the levels command. The other thing you can do, let me turn it back on. Even though I put in stars, sometimes you don't want all the stars to be that bright. So sometimes I just turn those down. So you have more of a hint of stars without them really dominating the image. And it doesn't dominate the image in this particular nebula because the nebula is so darn bright. But in sometimes it will, and so you want to kind of just tone down your stars. And there's different ways of doing it. You can do it with opacity. You can do it with your levels. You can do it with curves, even though I don't find the curves to be quite as productive as just doing simple with levels.
Eric, Hi Mervite was wondering why there aren't any masks that are used in this process, or
yeah, I found my unmute button. Let me just further ask the question. I know you had the luminosity layer, but you also had a whole bunch of normal layers on top of each other without masks. So I would have thought that the bottom ones would just be, not visible. Why is that?
Yeah, they are not visible. So the only point of doing all these different layers was to illustrate that as I select different parts of the image and adjust the histogram, you get a different result as opposed to adjusting the histogram of the entire image in the beginning, which is what most people do. So I kind of refer to this as kind of a multi-level adjustment because different parts of the image have different representations of sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen. And I don't want to treat them all as one. So I usually go from the darker areas to the brighter areas and kind of drill down. And since normally, your bright areas are towards the center, or at least towards one of the thirds of your image, that is a fairly representative way of doing it. In fact, Glenn, when you process your image, I think this would work beautifully on the data that you're collecting. By the way, at the end, if you look at the histogram, look at the colors, you see it's almost perfectly balanced. And you can never get that by doing an adjustment of the whole image in the beginning. So the layers are just to indicate the various steps. So sometimes I'll go through and I'll click off each one, showing how the image changed as we make this adjustment.
So in the end, you only really balance the center, the brightest part of the image, and the rest of them were unaffected in terms of balancing.
I balance them starting with the darker areas, this large selection, and then drill down and make smaller selections until I get to the brightest areas.
But the dark, one last time, but the ones where you did balance the darker areas are just on the bottom, and so they're not showing through.
Well, he's making a copy each time.
Yeah, I'm making a copy of the layer. So yeah, I just make a copy of the layer. I'm not making a selection and copying the selection, even though I guess you could.
Got it.
I'm just making a duplicate of the layer. So oftentimes I'll just step through and you can just see the changes.
Okay,
I can do that. Yeah, so.
No, I understand now. I didn't.
Okay, so I'm making just copies of the layers, so each one is an incremental change. And that's just to kind of illustrate the process. I mean, you could do it all in one layer, but if you have to go back, it makes it a little more awkward. So I just do it in multi-layers, and my NAS gets filled up a little more quickly than it probably should, but that's life.
Do you want to say anything about, did you just do StarNet to remove the stars, and you didn't
Yes,
have
I
to
did.
do it? You didn't have to do any cleanup, or?
StarNet works very well on narrowband images, not so much on RGB images, but then you don't really do tone mapping much on RGB. And sometimes you have to do some cleanup, but this data was so nice, and it's that your stars were so tight that basically I had to do almost no cleanup using StarNet.
Okay.
So you're right, StarNet, and our friend, I can't remember his name, he's actually working on a paid version of StarNet, trying to get over some of the issues that it has with, say, RGB images. You're right. I go into PixInsight, I do a standard stretch on these kinds of images. I'll do some noise reduction. In fact, on this image, I might go in and do some noise reduction, but that'd be kind of a waste of our time. I don't think we really have to do that. But there are some kind of noisy areas down here which I could clean up. Any more questions, or should we go on to the next one?
I think we can move on.
Okay. We'll save our work. Yes. And let's open up another image from down under. The Karina Nebula. And as far as color and beauty, this nebula in itself is kind of a work of art. If you ever get your hands on this data, you really cannot go wrong. Any way you process it, it's going to come out to be really beautiful. And so let's just do the same thing. I don't think I have to detail everything as before, but let's start out with our hydrogen alpha starless image. I'm going to copy it, make an RGB image, paste it in, grab the oxygen, which will be blue, copy it, open up the channels. Where's channels? Put this into the blue layer, and sulfur. You probably realize that I did some processing before we got to this point, and the processing, besides removing the stars, was really to stretch out the sulfur and the oxygen, so I don't have to do so much processing once I get in to do the Hubble palette. But if I took these the way they normally were, they'd be a lot darker. But getting rid of the stars allows me to stretch that histogram so that it is more or less balanced even from the start. So let's make a copy of that, put it into our Hubble palette image as red. And before we go too much further, let me select same profile. Now you can see from the start here that hydrogen alpha dominates this a little bit more than in the last image. And this is what you find with a lot of Hubble palette images when you start. Sometimes they'll be just totally green. And if you look, let me get rid of this other layer, which I don't want. If you look at the histogram, you will see that green, the hydrogen alpha, kind of dominates this particular image. So let's start making adjustments, just like before. I'll just make a series of layers. Each one I'll adjust brighter and brighter areas until we kind of drill down right to the center. We'll put on our luminosity layer, get a little more detail with high pass filtering, and have our final image. By now you know the drill. Image adjustments. We'll do an overall adjustment. And these are balanced by eye. There's no analytics involved. I just look at the histogram and try to get as much overlapping area as possible. Now, I can tell you that people that work with this nebula look at this image right here and say, well, that's good. Why should we go any further? But if you do a multi-level adjustment, you will find out you'll bring more variation of color. And really, that's the whole objective of doing a Hubble palette image, is to show the variation of the contribution of the 3 different emissions throughout the entire nebula. And adjusting the individual parts does more justice to this data than just saying, well, this looks pretty good the way it is. Why don't we just put luminosity on it and be done with it? I'm not happy with doing it that way. So let's make a copy. And let's just, we'll just select some areas here. This area kind of looks more or less the same. Feather it, let's 200 pixels, high dance, do the adjustment. Now, does that make a difference? So let's look at this area down here. This is unadjusted. I think it does. Make another copy. Let's adjust this area in here. As before, I'm trying to get these histograms to overlap just the best I can. Let's get more green. Is this better? Yeah, I think so. More variation. And another copy, and let's tackle this bigger area down here. This one looks pretty balanced, but once I get to a smaller selection, it will make a difference. And I think the last one we're going to select, let's select this right in here. And this is before, and this is after. Whereas before it looks kind of bluish, but now you see that there's other colors in here as well. And let's do a little bit of the Bob Franke adjustment. We'll give Bob credit. Go into my actions. Run the little script. Yeah, I kind of like what that did. So here's our starting image. Oops, that's no good. Single adjustment, and then the multi-level adjustment. Is that obvious to everyone?
Yeah, it's profound.
Well, not profound, just more interesting. So this is what you see normally. If you look on AstroBin and you look at a Karina, a Hubble palette, this is what you see. If you spend a little more time, what do we spend? 5-10 minutes max. You end up with a much more interesting image. So now let's put stars in it. Where's my hydrogen alpha? There he is. Put in stars. Make that a luminosity layer. I want to darken that a little bit more. And if you adjust a histogram, don't adjust this slider, because that all that's going to do is darken that outside area. You want to really adjust the midpoint, so you don't. I think that's pretty good. There's our tone map, and there's our image. You can see the little keyhole right in here. And if we had ourselves like a 24-inch telescope and really zoomed in on that, that would have tons of detail. You know, why don't we see whether we can extract a little more detail? I'm going to turn off luminosity. I don't think I can, but let's go right into the keyhole. And I'm going to select it. Because we all like the keyhole. And just feather that. Now 60 pixels. Hide the marching ants. Let's see what the histogram looks like. Let's histogram. You know, I think we can get a little more detail out of that. A little more color detail. No, that's a mess, isn't it? I'm not sure I'm not making this worse, but let's give it a try. I think we did get a little more color detail out of the keyhole. I think that looks better. So you can see once again that by going in and selecting specific areas, adjusting the histogram in a standard Hubble palette way, where you try to balance the 3 emissions, you end up with a more interesting image. So let's turn on our stars. And next thing we're going to do is get a little more detail. Take the starless image. Put on 4 copies. It should be on top of that. Let's see. Let's move that down. And you know the drill. Let me just zoom in so you can see the impact. High pass filter, start out with a lower number, 2 pixels. I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there's some little squiggly lines in here. And when I overlay it on top of the other, it brings out some of the edges. And you can see, let's zoom all the way in. It's almost just like focusing a lens. Can you see that? That change? Off, on. Let's do one with 3 pixels. All right, I'm going to turn them off. I'm sure you can see that. Just brings out more detail by highlighting the edges of the changes from light to dark.
We can see it, yeah. Does the image scale have a bearing on how many pixels you choose to do the high pass filtering?
It has to do with the quality of the image. So everything is different. If you really don't, this has a lot of resolution, so I can start out with really small pixels. If you don't have great resolution in your starless image, you'll start out a higher number. Everything is kind of done by feel. There is no right or wrong. And the larger number you choose for a high pass filter, the larger the structure you're going to emphasize. But I generally go like 2, 4, 6, 12, maybe even 24.
Okay.
High pass, let's go 6 pixels. Overlay. Yep, let's overlay it. Come on. And it's getting, I don't like the hardness of this, so I'm just going to take this down to 60%. And do one more at 12 pixels. That's a little too harsh. Let's bring it down to 25% contribution. And there's our finished image, which let's save. Not the tarantula. Let's let that save. And there's our Hubble palette image of the Karina Nebula with a little more emphasis on the keyhole. And again, you can turn off luminosity, and this becomes kind of an abstract work of art. And it's actually, let's see, do I have it up here? No, I didn't bring it up. It's in the basement. This is one of my favorite images of all time. The data was great, and the processing here was pretty easy. Any questions?
Glenn is wondering if you ever do RGB stars over narrowband, and if so, how do you blend them?
I have done it. It looks like crap. And I don't want to be glib about it, but here's the problem. There's different ways to do RGB and RGB-like stars. So you can take your images and you can just bring in the three-starred image, and you can assign them. You can map them just as regular images. Select those stars by making a starless image and put it on top. Or you can just do an RGB image and put those in here. But when you do it, what you find out is that RGB stars are big. compared to narrowband stars. These narrowband stars are tiny little things, they're little dots. No matter how good your data for an RGB star, it's going to be big and kind of blotchy, and you're not going to like it. And the second thing is RGB stars, the color scheme is completely different than a Hubble palette, and it's hard to look at. It doesn't look very good. So the answer is, I've done it, I've experimented with it, but I always kind of say blah and turn them off. But yeah, it's fairly easy to do. You can do it with narrowband data to get artificial colored stars, or you can do it with RGB data and then just bring the stars in. It's a fairly simple process. But star color really has no meaning in narrowband image. So the first thing I would say is, why would you want to do that? So it's really about the color of the Hubble palette image. It's about these greens to orange to blues to purple that really makes these images what they are.
Okay. And then, as an aside, so if you were doing RGB and you wanted to add some detail in hydrogen alpha and you did some hydrogen alpha, how would you generally blend that in?
Okay, so I do that all the time. Let me bring one up. I think I have one here. Give me a moment. Let me bring up. It's easier to show than it is to do it. The veil. I think this might show it. No. Yeah. Give me a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I did this with the veil. Let me see if this is the one. Okay, well, this kind of illustrates that this is a partially finished image. So let me uncheck everything. Okay, this is the RGB image of the lower part of the east veil. And this is part of a two-panel mosaic, so this is the lower part of it. So the way I add in the red from the emission is simply by taking the starless image and putting it in as a lightning layer. Let's turn that off. So basically, if you can see it over here, I take the starless image, I blacken out the G and the B. So basically I just have, so let's put this in as, I'll make this normal. So there's the starless hydrogen alpha red image. And I put it on top of the RGB image and change its application to lighten. So now every place you see red in there, that's a hydrogen alpha emission, it will be lit up. And the same thing with the oxygen emission. Take the starless image, I'll make this. So there's the oxygen emission, the starless image, and you make that a lightning layer. And now you've lit up so you can see all the oxygen emissions. And that's how I add them into an RGB image. So this is without and then with. And you can change how much you apply that. You don't have to apply it 100%. But in any RGB where I take the hydrogen alpha, the emission nebula, I always generate a starless image. If there's enough oxygen, I'll do a blue one. And if there's, of course, there's enough hydrogen, I will do a red one and light them up. And basically, it's just like shining a light on the emission nebula. And without that, you can still see where the emissions are, but it's not as dramatic. There's a finished image. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. And it's a nice, easy way to do it, and it looks beautiful.
Yeah, the problem is if you try to add in just, I know other people will take the hydrogen and mix it in with the red that you've gathered as in your R filter, but it's hard to control the look of the stars that way. So when you're working with starless image, it's very easy to control. And if you think there's too much lightning there, you can just simply change this to, well, that's a little too much red, so I'll make it 50%. I'll get rid of the. So I've just brought it down a little bit. You have complete control without changing any of the color of your stars. And in this particular lower part of this nebula, it's really important that you don't kind of overlay red by putting in, mixing your starred image into the red channel, which is exactly what you'll do. Then you'll have problems and your star color will change. So this doesn't affect star color at all.
Mm.
So that's how I do it. And this is part of a 2-panel mosaic. And this is just the lower part of the east veil. This was about a week's worth of data collection. No, we don't want to save it.
Nice.
Other questions?
Yeah, Pranab Dar was wondering if you have any insights on PI processing as opposed to Photoshop. What your favorite part, maybe what are your favorite aspects of PI, and where do you draw the line to come over to Photoshop?
So if you're someone like Warren, he does all his processing in PI. And God love him for that. I can't do that. So all the pre-processing, starting from my subs, all the pre-processing is done in PI. All the initial stretching and adjustments of color are done in PI. All the noise reduction is done in PI. And what else? Oh, there are little things that it does, like, for example, on the last image, if I figure it's a little too noisy, this one is not a noisy image, but the last one was a little too noisy in the color in the corners, I'll send it back to PI and do a little noise reduction. From that point, it gets saved as a TIFF and all the rest of the work is done in Photoshop. And why do I do it that way? Well, for one thing, I've been working with Photoshop for 30 years. So I'm not willing to flush that all away. And PI it's really good in some of the, the grand processes, and I think it's unmatched in things like all the pre-processing. I mean, there's no better program to do that. But if you want to go in and do some really fine adjustments, you really have to struggle to do that. And I don't think it's really made for, well, it doesn't have layers, so you can't do layer kinds of adjustments. You have to start writing little scripts in order to do some of the subtle things. And it's really not made for that. Although people like Warren, they'd go from start to finish and they produce fine images by using only PixInsight. So I use them both.
Okay. Do you have a favorite noise reduction process in PixInsight?
Yeah, TGV denoise.
Okay.
And of course that depends. If you're doing narrowband image and you end up with a sulfur image, which is really just weak, and you really have to stretch the crap out of it. I don't know if I can say crap, but I did. I end up using not just TGV denoise, which can get a little blotchy on some really weak images that are stretched, but I use MMT with I think 7 or 8 different layers, just to smooth it out. Because once I get into Photoshop, I really don't care. The detail is going to come from the hydrogen alpha. I'm just trying to get the color in from those weaker images. So like 80% is done with TGV denoise, and then sometimes for really noisy, blotchy images, I'll use MMT. And there was I think the astroimaging channel has really a nice, we did a nice session on noise reduction, which describes how best to use both of those processes.
Okay, excellent.
How are we doing?
Anybody have any more questions? Eric, is there anything that you have upcoming that you wanted to plug or talk about?
No, I never plug anything.
Okay.
I don't. I'm doing some work with Deep Sky West, and there might be some interesting things coming out there. But
could you? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'll let Lloyd promote what they're doing in Deep Sky West. But I've done some work with him, and there's some interesting things coming out in some processing.
Would you mind just going over how you're getting, exactly how you're pasting into the channels? Because I use a different process and I'm not sure I'm getting exactly what you're doing.
Okay, so for example, so here's my high pass filters, or say here's my luminosity layer. I'll turn this off.
Yeah, I just mean initially how you're getting the narrowband images into the color channels.
Oh, just cut and paste.
Right, but the exact
oh, okay.
Because I think you did it. I think you did it slightly differently in the two images, and I got confused.
All right. So, for example, here's my hydrogen alpha starless image. I use Control All. See?
Mm-hmm.
See the marching ants?
Yep.
I'll unselect it. I hate when it does that. Yeah. Okay, unselected. Control All. So now the whole image is marked. Control C is copy.
Mm-hmm.
Control N is new. And Control V is paste. It's
right, but
copy paste.
Okay, so you put the first one in, it comes in just as a layer, and then somehow later it magically becomes a red channel, and I don't understand how that happens.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So now you see the channels?
Yep.
Oh, this is now a grayscale image. I'm going to change that to a RGB image, and now we have 3 channels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now if I copy the oxygen, it's already marked at all, copy. I go to the new document, I select the blue channel, and I paste it in. Now the blue channel is oxygen. Then I select the sulfur image, copy it, Command C, go to my new document, select the red channel, paste it in. So now I put the sulfur in the red channel, the hydrogen alpha in the green channel.
How did the hydrogen alpha get in the green channel? Because it was just a layer.
Well, I know, but see, when I first put it in there, it's just a grayscale image. And when I converted it to RGB, the hydrogen alpha was in all the channels.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, because I just in fact, I could have started off, creating an RGB image and just put it into the hydrogen alpha into the green channel. But I just,
So in all the channels, and then you write over the red and the blue channel with the other.
Just right over. So now here, this is our starting image.
Okay, thank you very much.
Green. Yeah, no problem. Again, I've used Photoshop for so long. Probably some things that I don't even think about. And there are other ways of doing things.
Yeah, I've been using the adjustment layers, colorizing, and all that stuff.
Oh, I use adjustment layers all the time. For example, layers. So, you know about adjustment layers? Yeah, I love adjustment layers. So adjustment layers, let's say I want to, well, we know how to use it. So you put in adjustment layers. It doesn't really change anything, but you can, you can change saturation. turn it on and off. Yeah, I use adjustment layers. Let's delete this guy. I was just trying to cover the basics of how to do multi-layer adjustment to produce a Hubble palette image. And I'm not sure I'd use any adjustment layers on this.
Yeah, no, I was just referring to rather the way that I colorize rather than using channels to colorize the 3 different filters, I use adjustment layers.
I wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah, well, definitely try this way.
I mean,
Looks
basically,
really awesome.
This is kind of the way, this is a variation on the way JP does it. Basically puts them into different channels and then starts working with histograms. He actually does some other things now, which I may or may not agree with. And he doesn't do this kind of multi-layer adjustment. But if you know JP Mezzavino and you ever see his images, they are stupendous. They are just works of art, all of them.
Oh, he's the guy that did the 3D stuff, right? He's
Yeah, he does that.
Anarchy.
Yeah, he's Astro Anarchy. I've tried that, but it's so much work, and you end up with 10 seconds worth of video. It just really didn't appeal to me. It's I will I will leave that to him. It's a tremendous amount of work to put those different layers and then to fly through. Besides, the people that do CGI do that much better. That's another level of expertise. Any more questions?
Yes, John was asking, how do you process 2 different sets of exposure data, such as 300 seconds and 600 seconds on your elephant trunk nebula?
Did I do that?
I guess maybe you did.
Well, let me see if it's with one filter, I basically just bring them all together in PixInsight. And I will probably weight them by SNR. So if you go through the pre-processing script that they have there, you can put different weights on different parameters like SNR or eccentricity. And so probably if I have different, let's say I'm doing a full frame and some are 300 and some are 600 or 900, then the weighting will take care of how much each is used in the final stack. The other thing that you might be talking about is I might be doing a close-up of, say, the elephant trunk, and I will just feather that in Photoshop, and that's just process. So I won't try to bring that in the stack, say, of hydrogen alpha, but I'll take the hydrogen alpha stack, process that separately with a separate field of view, register it to the entire field of view, and then feather it in and try to match the brightness in Photoshop. In other words, to try to get more detail from, say, let's say you have a larger scope. Let's say I have some data from, a 17-inch. I'm trying to put in with the data from the Honda scope. So the answer is it kind of depends, but that's generally what I would do. But there are many more ways to skin cats, as they say. I can't say that too loud because we have 3 cats here. My wife will get upset.
Anybody have any other questions? No?
One more thing to show you.
Oh, sure.
Stop sharing. I'm going to close this down. Give it just a second to close. We're back. Yeah, I got one more thing. Give me just a moment. If I remember how we're doing this. Nope. Let's get that out there. I did a short video. We can take 4 more minutes of your time. A Chrome tab.
We're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically.
I think nature's imagination is so much greater than man's. He's never gonna let us relax, 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 relax.
We live in an in-between universe where things change alright, but according to patterns, rules, or as we call them, laws of nature.
I'm this guy standing on a planet. Really, I'm just a speck. I'm just a speck compared with a star. The planet is just another speck. To think about all of this, to think about the vast emptiness of space. There's billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of specks.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way of the cosmos to know itself.
Across the sea of space, the stars are others. We've traveled this way before, and there is much to be learned.
We're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically.
I find it elevating and exhilarating to discover that we live in a universe which permits the evolution of molecular machines as intricate and subtle as we.
I know that the molecules in my body are traceable to phenomena in the cosmos. That makes me want to grab people in the street and say, have you heard this?
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way of the cosmos to know itself.
There's this tremendous mass of waves all over in space, which is the light bouncing around the room, going from one thing to the other, and it's all really there, really, really there. But you gotta stop and think about it, about the complexity, to really get the pleasure. It's all really there, really, really there. The inconceivable nature of nature. To think about all of this, to think about the vast emptiness of space. There's billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of specks.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way of the cosmos to know itself.
Across the sea of space, the stars are others. We've traveled this way before, and there is much to be learned.
Wow, that was a small piece of your wonderful body of work. Are really nice.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Any
Thank
last
you.
minute questions? Oh, thanks. Appreciate the comments. Yeah, I think I was about 30 images. My portfolio has about, I think, 700.
Uh-huh. That is outstanding.
I'm slightly obsessed.
I think most of us can relate.
I don't know whether that's a good thing. Hold on one second. Let me just check. I thought maybe I was running. No, it's not going to start running for another 10 minutes. We're imaging tonight. If all goes well, we're going to complete Sharpless 112. I've already done the Hubble palette. Now we're going to do the RGB and put it and light them up with the hydrogen alpha and the oxygen, which are the two primary emissions from that nebula, from that sharpless object. Sharpless objects are really nice objects to work with. They don't cover your whole screen usually, but they really have some nice colors in them, and they're red. Any more questions? I'm kind of done.
I think that covers it. Thanks again. We really appreciate you presenting tonight, and thanks for coming, everybody. And we'll see you next month. Okay.
And thanks so much for having me. I really enjoy kind of sharing what I do, and if it makes a little difference to one or two people, that's a success. I'm speaking to you, Glenn.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm gonna.
No. When you process that nebula,
yep,
like that's a perfect candidate for that kind of processing because it's strong in sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen.
Yeah, so he's referring, before you guys all came on, I was sharing some data from Telescope Live on the Lagoon Nebula. So that's what we're talking about. So I will be using these techniques for sure.
And if you get stuck a little bit, just send me a note.
Okay, thank you. It's very kind.
All right, I'm going to say goodnight. It's way past my bedtime. Good night. Thanks again.
Thank you. Good night.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.